right, let's get started, and then as people join,
Okay.
they can just see what's going on. Okay, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us. This is a very exciting salon because we have Stephen Greenblatt, a distinguished Shakespeare professor, and Adam Phillips, who is a noted psychotherapist and writer, and they've written a book together about Shakespeare and Freud and what that can tell us about having second chances in our own lives. And it's a very interesting book. I'm Henry Oliver. I write a Substack called The Common Reader, which is often about Shakespeare. And I also wrote a book about late bloomers. So I have a lot of questions for Stephen and Adam. But after I've asked those, I'm going to open it up to you. And you can use, there's a little hand emoji, which you can use to say, please, I would like to ask a question. And then we'll know that you want to ask. And it stops people cutting across each other and getting confused. So, Stephen and Adam, thank you for joining us.
Pleasure. Thank you.
My first two questions are more personal. So when I read this book, I thought, this is not really a work of new historicism. And I also thought, is Adam an English professor now? Are you both having second or third acts? What's going on? This book is a departure in many ways, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I mean, I've always wanted to implicitly, at least, and sometimes explicitly connect the present with the past. So this has maybe more present than past in it, but it's not a complete departure from what has always compelled me.
Okay, so an evolution in the way you're thinking about Shakespeare. Yeah.
And my experience was that Stephen and I had talked over the years intermittently about writing a book together. And then he mentioned that he was going to write a book about second chances in Shakespeare. And almost literally the moment he said it, I realized that psychoanalysis was all about second chances. And it was as though the suggestion crystallized something. And then I, in inverted commas, absolutely knew that I could write this, and I could write about psychoanalysis from the position of the idea of second chances, which is such a resonant phrase. And in a way, I think that's how it started.
So when we're thinking about Shakespeare, just on a personal level, do you both prefer the comedies or the tragedies? Because they get very different treatment as to what they can tell us about second chances.
They do. At this point in my life, I might lean toward the romances, say toward the later plays about sort of older people who have somehow managed to keep going.
Well, at this stage in my life, I feel similarly, except that the tragedies have always had a very, very powerful effect on me. And I can remember reading Othello when I was about 17, and Hamlet and Lear and so on, and thinking this really was it. This was great literature. And I've never recovered from that. But it still feels that every time I read these plays or see them, they seem astounding to me. So I think I'm stuck there.
Yes, you have the tragic interest.
Yes.
Does this tell us something about psychoanalysis?
Well, at one level, it tells us something rather boring about psychoanalysis, which is simply that Freud had a sort of quasi-tragic vision.
Yeah.
I don't think that is the most interesting thing about psychoanalysis. But of course, Shakespeare was a touchstone for Freud.
Yeah.
And particularly Hamlet, of all the plays, I think, really. And I think that what it does show, so to speak, is that there is tremendous overlap between psychoanalytic preoccupations and some of what Shakespeare seems to be about, so to speak. And it's not that Shakespeare was as well, Freud before Freud or anything silly as that, but it does seem as though that there's a kind of ongoing cultural conversation and a set of preoccupations, and that Freud took them up in his own way, but also having been a great reader of Shakespeare and Goethe and various other people. So it seems to, for me, it seems to me kind of psychoanalysis seems of a piece in a certain sense with Shakespeare's work and other people's work too.
why do you think Freud was so obsessed with Shakespeare? And how different would his work really be if he hadn't had access to the plays?
It's very hard to say that. And I think it's a whole range from the cultural prestige of Shakespeare as the great world genius of literature, and Freud's Anglophilia, and a great identification with all that. I think that's in there somewhere. I also think that Freud was actually a very good and interesting reader. And clearly was genuinely interested in this. I mean, when he was 16, he was a passionate reader of Cervantes and Don Quixote, and he started a club, a friend of his, to actually read the book in its original language, and they studied it clearly. So Freud had a real passion for literature. He didn't actually have a passion for medicine, and he says several times in his life that he would not have been a doctor by choice, whatever that means. So I think in some ways, Freud was a reader before he was a doctor. Mm. And I think that what really interested him and moved him and engaged him and so on were initially Shakespearean tragedies. And I don't think psychoanalysis came out of those so much as I think this was part of, as were, the dream food of Freud's imagination.
So you don't agree that Shakespeare sort of anticipates a lot of Freudian ideas? Because when I read Shakespeare, I sometimes see a line, like there's a line somewhere about how if you stop up your emotions, if you stop up all your anger in your heart, it's like it turns to ashes in an oven or something. I can't remember the quote. Yeah. And I sort of think, well, surely Shakespeare came up with the idea of the unconscious and repressed, is that all these things that we attribute to more scientific investigation. You don't think it's like that?
No, I mean, I can see that. And there's definitely something in that. But the difference is, of course, is Freud has a different language. Freud has his own formal, quasi-scientific language that is a different kind of formulation. And okay. And I, and that's the difference. And I think it would be misleading to say Freud formulates in sort of scientific language what Shakespeare discovered, but there clearly are echoes and overlaps.
Mm. In any case, I would have said that Freud would be quite uninteresting to us if what he said was not resonating with what had been discovered, articulated, experienced again and again and again, not simply by Shakespeare, but by a whole range of people from Homer on. Otherwise, what's the point? If it is simply something that is an entirely new language that doesn't speak to human experience. And insofar as the art, the great literature that we care about is the articulation at a profound level of human experience, you would expect, it's not a surprise that Plato says, well, people dream about sleeping with their mothers all the time. That this wasn't a sudden discovery in the late 19th century.
Yeah, and these are all interventions in an ongoing cultural conversation. Certain preoccupations recur.
Stephen, why was Shakespeare so obsessed with second chances, and does it mark him out from his contemporaries? I don't think of Ben Jonson, for example, as a big second chance guy.
No, I think it's true. I think it is quite, nor is Christopher Marlowe.
Right.
Is Shakespeare's greatest rival and contemporary. I think this is a peculiar signature, and I don't have a very easy explanation for it. It's partly, and by the way, that the interest in second chances is somehow built into Shakespeare's own. It's not simply that he's interested in how you or I might have a second chance in life, but if you actually look at the unfolding of his career, he keeps going back to things he's thought about and tries to give them a second chance in his own work. It's a very peculiar, almost obsessional quality in him. Yeah. So that's, I mean, there may be a biographical explanation that I hint at, but I don't want to beat over the head in the book. I mean, there may be something about the way he played out his life, basically leaving his wife and children back in Stratford. If you look at the Playhouse wills, they're called. I mean, there have been there's a collection of last will and testaments that were written by people who were in the theater world in the 18th and 17th century. It's very convenient. And you read those, almost all the people who actually had their wives and children with them. Shakespeare didn't. We don't know why. But we do know that he, at the end of his life, he went back to Stratford. So perhaps something was in his mind, in his heart personally, but maybe not.
I think that one of the distinguishing features of Shakespeare's work is that his plots could always go in several directions. A lot of his plays that you sort of constantly feel like, well, this could go either way. This is a hinge. And this is a sort of discovery he made, that actually plots are much more malleable. Is there something in this, that his obsession with second chances?
That's a wonderful point. Really spot on, because they mark really from the beginning, from an early play like Comedy of Errors. Comedy of Errors is a tragedy, and I mean, it's got disaster written all over it from the beginning to the end. It's under the shadow of an execution. It's under the shadow of the loss of family, and so forth and so on. And one signature, basically, in all of Shakespeare's comedies is that the tragic possibility. Long before he started to experiment in what period called tragicomedy, those disturbing plays like Measure for Measure, but even in the happy comedies, there's always a tragic possibility. And correspondingly, the tragedies are full of crazy comedy. Hamlet plays the clown in his own play. And we know that, in fact, we know that Shakespeare's a contemporary like Sir Philip Sidney, thought this was absurd. He hated the idea of mixing kings and clowns. But Shakespeare does it as a kind of signature.
Now, you both stress the point that we interpret ourselves and we interpret our past. And this is obviously something that Shakespeare's characters are doing all the time. But as well as being a Freudian idea, that's quite a Puritan idea. And I wonder if second chances are fundamentally religious, and that Shakespeare and Freud were secularizing these things.
Well, I think one of the things we were inevitably sort of up against or involved in here is the idea of redemption.
Right.
And the idea of, as it were, being saved. So there's something, second chances run the whole range here, from the idea of literally being saved, being redeemed, to the more ordinary local second chances in an everyday lived life. But I think there's a great deal of overlap here because, as we say in the book, it starts with the point at which something goes wrong. And then a second chance is required to, as it were, redeem that first opportunity that was missed. That would be one way of describing this. And so I think all the time in the book, one way or another, we're managing, in a sense, the idea of secularized redemption, or what redemption could possibly mean if you, as it were, reduce it simply to the idea of the second chance.
I like the emphasis on secularized, because I at least think, though there's, as you probably know, a long history of disagreement on this subject by people who care about Shakespeare, I tend to think of Shakespeare as, how should we say, post-Christian, deeply absorbing Christianity and its dream of redemption, but folding it back into this life. However many gestures there are toward flights of angels sing thee to thy rest, I think that none of the plays suggest that angels are going to lift the characters up to a second chance in heaven. I think if you're going to have it, it's going to be here. And if you're not going to have it, it's going to be here.
So is Shakespeare more radical than we realize?
I do think that Shakespeare is I mean, the interesting thing about Shakespeare, to go back to what Adam said before, is, and what your question suggests, I certainly don't think that Shakespeare was either a card-carrying Puritan or a card-carrying Catholic.
Sure.
I think he was he behaved himself and went to the Anglican services, I mean, the services in the Church of England. Otherwise, he would have been reported for absence, as his father was reported for absence. but I don't think that the focus in Shakespeare is on the afterlife and on the rectification of the difficulties of life in some other sublime, transcendent vision. When there's talk of redemption in Shakespeare, when Hal in Henry IV, Part 1 talks about redeeming the time, he's thinking about his future here and now, not about a redemption in some afterlife.
How much control do we have over our own second chances? One reading of this book is to say that, like, what you basically think is not very much, and you're constantly trying to find ways in which we can have that control, but it doesn't amount to as much as we want, as much as we think. It's quite a deterministic book in a way.
Or second chances precisely raise the question of agency and choice. Because there wouldn't be such a thing as a second chance if one believed in absolute determinism. So it's as though what the idea of the second chance tests and experiments with is the degree to which we can be, as it were, the authors of our own lives, or we can make choices that significantly change things. And obviously, it's a familiar paradox in psychoanalysis that Freud gives us a picture of human beings as almost absolutely determined, yet he invents a therapy which is an intervention in these determinisms that actually apparently makes a difference. So that people can go from feeling driven to feeling more able to choose at least some elements of their own lives.
There's an interesting passage in the conclusion. To believe in second chances is to believe, as psychoanalysis does, that some people can be changed. I'm very struck by the use of the word "some people." And of course, the phrase "the author of your own life" comes from Coriolanus, who is one of the least plausible candidates for any sort of second chance. What is it about people that stops them having these opportunities? Can we control ourselves in any way? Or is it just that we go to psychoanalysis, we go to Shakespeare, and it's the luck of the draw. We find out, yes, you're an amenable person, or no, you're a bit of a Hamlet, or you're a bit of a Coriolanus. Could it get quite bleak for people looking into this?
Well, it could get quite bleak, but I mean, there are also ways of talking about this that are not unencouraging. Like, for example, we can choose to go to bed, but we can't choose to go to sleep. We can choose to go and talk to somebody, but we can't choose to make them our best friend. In other words, we're always, it seems to me, often people like us, if there isn't us here, are working on precisely the question you're raising, which is, where do we make choices and where are we ineluctably simply driven towards something? And it would seem to me that tension is always around. It's clearly around Shakespeare, but it's very much around in Freud, where Freud is trying to work where, if anywhere, we might be able to make realistic choices about our lives.
So it's a question of experimenting and finding where the gaps are.
I think it is a question of experiment. In a way, psychoanalysis itself as a treatment experiments with the idea of what, if anything, about one's life can be revised and redone. So, for example,
I want to maybe add one third term here between agency on the one hand and determinism on the other, which sits uncomfortably, but is, I think, quite important for Shakespeare, which is chance. That Shakespeare is a kind of, from the beginning really, and all the way to the end, quite interested in the strange combination of things that you can control, things that are determined, but also things that just actually happen randomly and by chance. And the comedies are full of that. You just have to hope that the pieces are going to fall in place, and you accept the fact that you're living in a world in which that's the case. If you turn right, one thing happens. If you turn left, another thing happens. But you can only turn in one direction. It's quite accidental whom you're going to bump into, but your life may change. And at the same time, that there's a strange feeling of force, being in a force field that is pushing you in one direction, and that you can, well, not that you can necessarily determine yourself through agency, but you can actually acknowledge it. Because one thing that happens at late Shakespeare, particularly in terms of chances, is that it becomes important in Shakespeare not that people take control of their lives. So there's a certain amount of that, but also just people acknowledge, come to terms a little bit with who they are, and speak of it to themselves or to somebody else. That's very clear from late Shakespeare characters, from Leontes, from Prospero, that Shakespeare's interested not that much in their power, though he is interested in their power, I mean, in the case of Prospero particularly, but he's interested in what it means to actually come to terms, to actually have some moment of recognition, an acknowledgement of fault, for example, or an accepting of responsibility, very basic things that aren't necessarily agency, but that are forms of self-recognition.
Yeah. And presumably the reason determinism and agency are so compelling is because it's in that direction that we find intelligibility and explanation. Whereas with chance, obviously, that's acknowledging, as it were, our lack of a coherent sense of the intelligibility of our lives. Freud talks in the essay on Leonardo about whether somebody can allow chance to determine their fate. And that's like a glimpse, if you like, or into another world, into an acknowledgement simply of the contingency of one's life. That, as it were, anything can happen to anybody, and all sorts of things do happen that are neither determined nor are they choices. And that's where our omnipotence and our capacity for explanation, understanding
Is that Coriolanus's problem? He refuses to let chance play any sort of role. Because I think Coriolanus for me is like there is no other way this one's going to end. There's just all that straight through all the way. Like this guy is doomed. He's the anti-second chance play, right?
Yeah, I mean, Coriolanus's absolute inner inflexibility, his radical inflexibility, radical refusal to acknowledge any possibility other than to be what he is. The curious thing about Coriolanus in relation to having a conversation with Adam is that Shakespeare sees this as so tied into Coriolanus's relationship to his mother. On the one hand, his fantasy is that he's somehow autochthonous, that he has no obligation to anyone, and that turns out to be the revelation of his absolute dependence on his relationship to his mother. That's an extremely peculiar combination. Maybe not peculiar. Maybe it's predictable, Adam.
I mean, the thing about the tragic heroes is that they're not people who can simply let things happen. They are, as it were, control freaks. And they're people who, in this language which we've just been speaking, all the time are wanting to believe in their own absolute autonomy. And that becomes their problem, in a sense, which is they can't allow themselves the dependence or the capacity for exchange in which there would be renewal or nourishment. In that sense, they're monomaniacal. They're insulated and isolated.
I have another question about the tragic heroes. You write that they wrongly believe they have been betrayed by the people they love. And this like holding on to this stubborn idea that you've all betrayed me is what sort of stops them having a second chance. And I can totally see that with most of them. But was Hamlet really wrong to believe he'd been betrayed? Doesn't Hamlet have quite good grounds for his grievances?
I suppose you might say that sometimes a paranoid is actually being persecuted. So maybe that's true. I mean, Hamlet, I suppose the curious thing about Hamlet is that the revelation that he's been actually persecuted is belated, is after his sense of that in a way. And that's interesting. That is to say, Shakespeare cunningly delays any actual evidence that his uncle has killed his father. And even after his uncle has killed his father, his uncle is behaving as if he really genuinely wants to absorb Hamlet, as it were, into the happy family. So that doesn't mean the uncle's not wicked, but there's no indication that the uncle actually wants to to do Hamlet in until Hamlet begins to behave himself in a murderous way. That doesn't justify the wicked uncle. It's only to say that Hamlet's sense of the bitter depression, melancholy, anger that Shakespeare depicts at the beginning in Hamlet is something that is welling up not from a legitimate, not from an objective account of the persecution, but from a vision of what's happened to him. His father has died suddenly. He hasn't become the king. His mother's remarried. He's betrayed. He can't come to terms with any of that.
Is that not a legitimate betrayal, though? Like his uncle married his mother, which is a sort of betrayal of the idea of the original marriage and of his father. And his mother, instead of supporting him, marries the uncle, and he is legitimately sort of isolated by those two. And what we can say is, well, actually, to begin with, he isn't a paranoid maniac. He's reacting how most people would react. And when the ghost comes along, it's genuinely tragic because he is stuck in his own fate.
And also, Hamlet is always wondering whether he's betraying himself.
Yeah.
That would seem to me also something to do with this as well. He's wondering what self-betrayal would be, or what it would be to betray himself.
Okay, interesting.
I mean, it may look at, I mean, one doesn't want to leap away from, but into the subject that we're discussing, one doesn't want to pull back too far from the actual circumstances of that particular play. But insofar, again, thinking about this conversation with Adam, insofar as the play depicts the difficulty that a child has acknowledging, in this case, his mother's separate identity and sex interest, the hysteria with which Hamlet later in the play urges his mother not to get in bed with her husband, not to let his reachy fingers touch her, and so forth and so on. That seems to push out way beyond the immediate circumstances of the play to something that Shakespeare is exploring that has to do with how hard it is, a subject that I think he's genuinely interested in, how hard it is for parents to accept the fact that their children are independent beings, and how far it is for children to recognize that their parents actually have lives.
Yeah, and the other way around, or as you've just said, which is that the child can feel betrayed by the fact that, in this case, the mother is a sexual creature, because the child knows that when the mother's having sex, the child is forgotten about.
I really like the chapter on the Winter's Tale in this book. It's one of my favorite of the plays. And it seems perhaps the most relevant. Now, there was a recent piece, I think in August, in The Atlantic, saying that a lot of people are now cutting out their relatives. Could be parents, could be siblings, could be uncle, it's all different types. And it's a range of things to do with political views, incompatibility. It's a whole bunch of stuff, right? And obviously, sometimes it's justified, sometimes it's very sad and tragic, and it's a complicated issue. How do you think The Winter's Tale can help us think about this sort of modern situation where more and more people are estranged from their families, but through their own choices rather than through the whims of fate or whatever?
One thing that Adam, I thought, taught me in the course of our writing the book together is that people often choose their unhappiness. People, surprisingly, people who seem to be seeking help to be happy are actually often much more driven to choose unhappiness. And so, I mean, maybe I would start there. There's a strange moment at the beginning of The Winter's Tale, as you know, in which when the Leontes is before he's brought it to the public, but in which he's saying to his principal advisor, "My wife is slippery," and he said, the advisor says, "You're mad. I mean, it's absolutely not true." And he said, "Do you think I would actually want to suffer this way if I didn't know it?" But that is actually the a key question. Why does someone want to suffer? Why do you choose that? I mean, and losing your family is suffering, even if your family is problematical, even if your members of your family have voted for the wrong candidate in an election. So I will actually turn to Adam to help us understand why people resist their own healing.
Well, one answer would be to do with self-punishment. I mean, there's a whole range of answers, and it's very difficult to generalize about this. But one of the advantages of suffering is that you're not enviable, for example. No one will envy. The other advantage of suffering is that it creates a self-punishment for all the, as it were, guilty thoughts and desires you might have had. Now, it would seem to me, if we take the parallel you mentioned about people, as it were, relinquishing their family members, it could be, I mean, this is an absurd generalization, but it could be true, couldn't it? That it's as though this is like a manic wish for self-definition. That the trouble with the family is, it, as it were, decides who you are. You suffer from the family's descriptions of yourself. So if you want to be much more self-invented, you relinquish those people who claim to know you. You cut those ties with a view to being much more self-defining. And it would be, again, it's like the thing we talked about earlier, it would be like a denial of dependence. It would be, to some extent, experiencing the family as stifling something about oneself. Therefore, it needs to be relinquished.
And what's your reading of The Winter's Tale, Adam? That doesn't, is that what Leontes is doing?
I mean, Shakespeare seems to suggest, first of all, let me say there's a general, I think from early on, and more and more intensely through a play like Othello, and then in a Winter's Tale is a kind of redoing of Othello.
Right.
Of what's the matter with men? What's the matter with men?
Yeah.
That it's surprising because Shakespeare is not writing as a you know 21st century feminist, but he comes back to this question repeatedly, and the suggestion is that there's something wrong with with men's relationship to their own and to their sexual experience. I mean, it's very intensely and explored in Othello, and then intensely explored again in The Winter's Tale. So The Winter's Tale begins with this extremely strange dialogue having to do with memories of the friendship between the two boys, Leontes when he was a boy and his friend Polixenes, the best friends, when they were officially not sexual. They were like bleeding lambs. Shakespeare gives this kind of slightly creepy language for what they were, and they explicitly say that was before they met their wives. So it marks from the beginning that there's something about becoming sexual, and something about the dream of their friendship, whatever their friendship is, they understood their friendship to be pre-sexually, that is causing some tremendous disturbance in Leontes, in letting his friend go, return to Bohemia. So it would be, I think diagnoses are a peculiar game to play and probably not appropriate here, but that at least is something that Shakespeare is interested in what is underlying disturbance, and it has to do. I mean, in the case of Othello, it has to do with a feeling of pollution or stain. I'm not sure it's pollution or stain in The Winter's Tale, but a feeling of losing control of this tremendously satisfying because pre-sexual. And of course, it takes place when Leontes' wife is in her 9th month, as the man watches his wife about birth. And maybe to continue that, it's a play ends with really thought difficult, which was connect the fact that there's another generation that they're, when in the case of the winter, and the case of King Lear too, of age, in the case of the Winter's Tale, when his daughter Perdita is of reproductive age, and the man has to pull back, as it were, and accept that there's another generation that will follow, and that he's in effect supernumerary.
And if you were to,
sorry, go ahead.
if you were to follow this up from a psychoanalytic point of view, you could say something like, psychoanalysis was invented to address everybody's terror of their own misogyny. And what psychoanalysis, or Freud and follows and so on, add to this is the idea that it's not that men or people hate women, it's they hate their need for women. And that's what gets attacked in misogyny, that the woman is blamed, as it were. But what the men are suffering from, and obviously Othello and Leontes are prime examples of this, is they can't bear the fact that they need their women, and their women are independent people with their own lives. So they must be murdered or got rid of, etc. But I think that, you know, as Stephen says, this is something about the absolute, something really horrifying about male sexuality and the murderousness built into it because of the hatred of dependence.
I have a few more questions, but then we will be able to take questions from all of you who are listening. So if you want to put your questions in the chat now or use the little hand emoji, please do so, and then we will be able to ask Stephen and Adam those questions shortly. Okay, so you may say you don't have an answer to this question, and that's fine, but I see a few things in the world today that are relevant to the idea of can there or can there not be a second chance, and is a second chance sometimes good or sometimes bad? The first one is obviously everyone said the election of Trump was this great sort of second act comeback thing. The second one is what's called the fertility crisis, which is the just general declining rates of fertility in the industrialized economies. And the third one is crime, which, well, I don't think we know what's happening with crime, but there's a lot of feelings in places like London and some American cities that there's a lot of crime going on. We have lots and lots of people in prison in our societies, and the idea of having a second chance after that is hugely relevant. How can Shakespeare and Freud help us think about these sort of second chance issues that we face today? And if you want to say, this is a terrible question, I don't want anything to do with it, please feel free.
I mean, it is, a big question. Sorry, go on.
No, only to dismiss the middle question about fertility, to say that Shakespeare lived in a world, and we might now wish for it or envy it, and
oh, I think Stephen's frozen. Stephen, you're cutting in and out a bit. Let's go to Adam and see if your connection recovers in a second.
I can stop, check out and check back in and see if that works better.
Oh yeah, try that. Yeah.
Okay.
Adam.
The trouble with psychoanalysis is it's got something to say about everything. and that is a slight disadvantage. I think that, obviously, these three examples you give are very, very different. It would seem to me psychoanalysis might be particularly useful in talking about punishment, both the desire to be punished and the desire to punish. Because one of the things that seems to be pretty clear from prison research and so on is that punishment doesn't work. It's as though we punish people when we don't know what else to do with them. And the other bit, of course, is that people in this, at least in the Freudian story, are seeking punishment. They commit crimes because they want to be punished. So this makes the whole thing, in a way, rather, it isn't in reality, but it can sound rather absurd, because it's as though punishment is the object of desire. Now, if we address that first, then we may feel quite differently about all the forms of punishment we've got. Because the other thing, of course, that Freud says, not only Freud says this, is that punishing people is sexually exciting, can be sexually exciting, and being punished can be sexually exciting. So what we're seeing is, if you like, on a cultural level, a kind of sadomasochistic, we're assuming that sadomasochism is the fundamental paradigm of relationships. And that means that there has to be somebody making somebody else feel small in order to feel big. There must be somebody who has to sacrifice themselves in order to be the guardian of somebody else's potency. So, you know, in psychedelic language, the masochist says, you can do anything you like to me as long as you never leave me. The sadist says, I can do whatever I like to you because you'll never leave me. Now, it's all about how one makes people dependent, how one hooks people in. And I think the risk is that for want of a better word, the prison system actually exacerbates this problem rather than solving it. And it creates, you know, in there being a furor of righteous indignation, there's a great deal of pleasure and excitement of thinking about all these people being punished.
Interesting. Stephen, are you back?
You can let me know whether I'm back. Am I still?
Yes. No. We can hear you better now.
Okay. Now, I agree with Adam's account. I think that the at least in the American model, the original the idea that was once at least floated around that the idea of imprisonment was for rehabilitation and a second chance is largely non-existent now. That we have an enormous carceral system, but I think there's almost no serious interest in rehabilitation and second chances at all. It really is about punishment and punishment alone. And I do think that the current moment in the United States, at least, seems to depend or to draw upon at least a feeling in a significant segment of the population that they'd like to see more punishment, and that they want to release that aggression. We'll see what happens.
But we can't, for example, can't imagine kindness, for example, without the idea of a second chance being integral to it.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. I like this. One of the sections I liked most was about play. And I think this is in Adam's part of the book, where you talk about play is the way that children sort of make themselves the master of an experience that they couldn't actually control in real life. And I have children, and I read that and I thought, oh my goodness, that's what they're doing all the time. How can play help those of us who are not children? If there are people looking for second chances, looking for this experimentation, should we be doing more play?
Well, perhaps we should have more opportunities to imaginatively experiment in ways that mean we don't then have to act out our most violent and retaliatory feelings. I mean, in the example I give in the book, which is Freud's famous example of, it was his grandson who is in his cot and he keeps throwing away this object and reeling it back in again. And what Freud says is that he's experienced his mother's absence as terrible and that he is the victim of it. So in this game, it's as though he's the master of it. He gets rid of the object and he pulls it back. And in that process, it's as though he's, at its best, learning how to manage absence without retaliation. So if this is some sort of model, we might say, yes, if retaliation is one of the worst things we do, then one of the things we might do in play is experiment with alternatives. The thing about play is when it's non-fascistic and non-omnipotent is that it's actually open to possibilities. It's a form of experimentation. And of course, second chances is essentially about an experiment in living. And you can never know what the well, you can't know the consequences of your words and actions, obviously, but you can't know the consequences of your second chances. But because it feels or has been recognized as a second chance, you might have a slightly better idea of what you want to do with this opportunity second time round. And you might have a clearer sense in which you've spoiled things or violated things in a way that you actually don't want to do again. So it's reparative at its best.
I would only add to that that we do, in fact, as a society, have significant investment in play of this kind. That is to say, films, plays, theater plays, poetry, fiction, all are fundamentally forms of playing out alternative chances in your life, second chances. One of the, maybe we just need to encourage more of this. One of the things that's slightly dreary to me when I ride on public transportation now is that when I used to see people sitting with a novel, it didn't matter I wasn't never worried about what the literary quality of the novel was, but I used to see people with a novel. Now I see them just holding their phones. And you can be sure that they're not reading poetry or novels on the phone. So that there's been a kind of reduction of the time that we spend collectively as a society playing out our alternative possibilities.
I have two more questions, and then we'll look at the questions in the chat, or take questions if you want to speak. Okay, at another point in the book, you say that fantasy can be more revealing of the truth than sober facts, and art is how we step into someone else's fantasy. But if we're one of these people for whom a second chance is really not very likely, and we're a bit stuck in our circumstances, will the escaping into the fantasy of art thing, will that be consoling, or will it be a bit tormenting? Because you're...
Well, the risk is that fantasy becomes a refuge as opposed to the precondition for an exchange. So that insofar as we retreat into our fantasies, we're doing the equivalent of living in a world designed by ourselves. If we can allow our fantasies to be exchanged, as it were, with another person, then there's the opportunity for some nourishment, for something to happen. So from my point of view, anyway, it's all about possibilities for exchange that create alternatives. I think I know what I want, and I force you to give it to me. Or I have a relationship in which I have an idea of what I want, and I put it to you, and you might modify what I want. And so it becomes a conversation rather than a command.
So you don't think there's a worry that people who are truly stuck in their circumstances will go into the fantasy of art and find it actually, not just unhelpful, but quite upsetting, because it's showing them this is a fantasy that you can't even think about trying to achieve. There's no sort of...
Yes, I mean, I assume that obviously these are about the uses of art, and art is extremely diverse. And presumably one of the reasons we go to it is to open up our experience, that there's always a temptation to narrow one's mind. And the narrowing of one's mind is a form of self-starvation. So we're wondering what we can, as it were, open ourselves to, or what might be out there that is going to be a nourishing exchange, as opposed to thinking everything out there is terrible and I need to keep myself to myself.
You wouldn't say to someone, a patient or just someone you knew, for example, you're spending too much time. You need no movies for you, no novels for you. You need to get into the real world.
No, because I wouldn't see these as oppositional, if you see what I mean. I would see that potentially novels are a way into the so-called real world, and novels are part of the real world.
Yeah. Okay.
I mean, I was thinking about your question in terms of a long-term speculation about why people like to see tragedies, or what's at stake when people see tragedies. And the answer, of course, is a range of possibilities. One famous theory about what goes on when people see tragedies is that it's comforting there's a famous passage in Lucretius in which he says it's comforting to look down from a high point at a ship foundering in the ocean, sinking. You can't do anything about it. You're seeing people die, but it's comforting to know that you're on dry land. I find that a very peculiar and grim idea. And I think that the alternative is to recognize that in some way or other we're all on the ship. I don't mean that we're all drowning, but that we're precisely never on such completely stable ground. And I think that is actually very good for us to recognize, psychologically healing for us to recognize, not to feel that we're invulnerable, but to feel that we're part of a human condition in which everyone is actually on board.
One of the things I had in my mind is something that the novelist Penelope Fitzgerald said, which is that comedy is a much harder thing than tragedy, because when you're trapped in a tragedy, you know you can die and there's a way out. Whereas when you're trapped in the problems of a comedy, there's no way out. It's quite a bleak point of view, but I did wonder, to put it in crude terms, when you're 17 and you go and see As You Like It, it's easy to look at that play and think, I'll meet a Rosalind, I'll fall in love, I'll get, I'll have these things in my life. By the time you're middle-aged, you might go to that play and think, well, youth's wasted on the young people, so it's all right for some. And it might become a much more miserable experience. Do you see what I mean? Is there some risk that art actually can be a kind of depressing thing for people, depending on where they...
We're not going to be able to legislate against that middle-aged experience you describe. Presumably everything's going to depend on the kind of conversations we've had as we've grown up and the kind of educations we've had and what has been made available. And for example, we might know people who make a very strong case against the retreat into cynicism, say. The idea that that in middle age, this person who's seen this play in this way is actually at last in touch with the reality. There's no reason to believe that. So if we are willing to entertain the idea that there are multiple perspectives and aspects, we're not going to settle into a kind of fascist state of mind, which says, I know this is the truth and it's terrible. We won't want that kind of truth, that kind of self-punishing, self-limiting perception.
I guess my version, my own middle-aged phenomenon of seeing Shakespeare's comedies, as opposed to seeing them when I was very young, is that I allow myself, though, to think, what kind of marriage is Rosalind and Orlando going to have?
Yeah.
What will it be like to be Viola married to the very strange Orsino? And what about Portia and Bassanio? But I think Shakespeare means you even, how should we say, all the way when you're young too, to reflect on the fact that, there's a certain moment of incredibly intense, thrilling connection, and then you will have to work out, if you're lucky, you'll have to work out the relationship, and Rosalind and Orlando doesn't seem like a very bright candle, but Rosalind is incredibly interesting. But they'll figure it out as best they can.
This is a good segue to my last question. You wrote about how happiness depends less on sorting everything out than just on accepting the muddle and embracing the consequences. I like this because I think if you had to say, like, what is the, like, big moral of the story from all of Shakespeare's work, the phrase "all's well that ends well" is a good summary. Things go wrong, things go well. It's much less in your control than you think. And when we're thinking about second chances, are we trying to push back against the modern culture of, like, idealizing and daydreaming and wanting your best life? And maybe we should take a Shakespearean view, which is like, take what you can get. If things work out pretty well, that's great, because you could be in a tragedy right now. And there's a kind of pragmatic, consequentialist perspective he's giving us, which is to say, if it's going okay, it's going great. Just roll with it. What do you think of that? British cynicism, maybe.
Well, one of the great things about Shakespeare is you can't summarize him. And Shakespeare doesn't actually, Freud does, but Shakespeare actually doesn't tell us how to live. But what you do witness whenever you see a Shakespeare play is how astonishing language is, how astonishing verbal exchanges and what people are capable of saying to each other and the effect people are capable of having on each other through their language. That seems to me endlessly absorbing. And so we're not going to come out, I think, realistically and be able to say, well, what Shakespeare believes is X, or what we learned from Shakespeare about how to live is. It's not going to be like that. It's going to be much more evocative than informative.
And I do think that's an interesting way you've put it just now in your question. I think the general message from Shakespeare, if there is a general message at all, is not just as he could easily have said in a world in which there was, for example, no divorce really for anyone. Just accept what you have and just muddle on through and take care and don't worry about it. I actually don't think that's the spirit of any of the plays, of the comedies either. I mean, let alone the tragedies, that you just, muddle on through. But because the characters actually don't do that. They're in search of something. They're looking for something. They're dreaming about things, and it's just that you have to actually recognize you may not get every piece that you want. You may have to rely on chance, hope for the best. But that's different from just hunkering down and accepting the circumstances into which you were born. That was a familiar lesson that was preached endlessly to people, that they should just accept what they have, the world that they have, and make the best of it. But I don't think that's not what I get anyway from Shakespeare.
I'm thinking more that people will often say, the ending of these comedies is very problematic. How comfortable should we be with the way Bertram talks to Helena at the end and all this sort of thing? Whereas I think the general tenor of the plays is to say, they found their way to a decent outcome. Great. Why are we quibbling this? This could easily have been a complete disaster.
Yes,
it's that kind of.
Yes, I think that's true.
Right. Okay, let's go to some questions in the chat because they have been lining up. David asks, will a psychoanalytic treatment have the aim of a second chance from the outset, or does the possibility arise at some point, maybe over time, almost as a dramatic event or a turning point?
Well, I think the obvious answer to that would be both, but the psychoanalytic treatment doesn't have the kind of psychoanalysis I value, doesn't decide beforehand what the aim of the treatment is. Indeed, part of the treatment is to work out what it is that might be wanted and whether this is a plausible want. So when people come and see me, I'm not imposing a cure on them, because you could think that the question to be asked of any psychoanalytic treatment is not what has it cured, but what has it inspired. For me, it would be that way around.
Okay. Tarquin has 3 questions, and they're all very interesting, actually. Can we distinguish between a second chance in general and a second chance to speak? That's an interesting topic in terms of Shakespeare. Just having the chance to speak, is that in and of itself enough of a second chance for some people?
That's interesting. I have to think about this. I think it is I'm immediately thinking counterfactually about the opposite of what Tarquin is asking about, but maybe it could lead there. King Lear famously begins with Cordelia looking for a chance not to speak. As I say, somewhat perversely in response to Tarquin's question, my first thought is, no, the situation in King Lear is that Cordelia, the other sisters want to make their big declarations, and Cordelia wants not to say anything. Nothing, she says first. She just doesn't want to answer at all. And yet, the play, as it unfolds, ultimately allows her, but only very tragically, to say something to her father, to actually express her love, in that case, to her father when he kneels down to her and she says, you have no cause. But maybe this is what Tarquin is getting at. It takes, in the case of that play, the entire play to get Cordelia from the point of her choice not to speak to the moment in which she can actually articulate her love for her father safely, and on her own terms.
Yeah. Okay. Next question. Are there any memorable examples for you of anyone who turned down a second chance?
Oh.
Might be a sad question.
Well, in a way, I mean, one of the things we say in the book is that these so-called tragic heroes are people who continuously turn down second chances. They don't want a second chance. They want to push their first chance all the way through to the end. So it would seem to me that, and in a way, the book's partly about this, which is what are the preconditions for actually recognizing a chance as a second chance and accepting it? And then the question would be, of course, and why might one reject it? Why might one not take a second chance?
Yeah, there's a spectacular staging of what the question asks in at the beginning of Macbeth, in which Macbeth actually says to his wife, "No, it's all off. We're not doing it. I've made the decision. We're going to go on. We're going to go on with the nice life we have." And then a moment later, he decides to do this thing that will foreclose any other possibility for him. And the question that the play asks and doesn't answer is, why does he do that?
Yeah, that's one of the moments I think is a sort of all's well that ends well moment. He could have just said, "Oh, you know what? Things are going okay. Okay is not a tragedy. Let's just stay here, please." Okay, this one, I really like this question. What do you think people get out of the second chance of talking to an artificial intelligence avatar of a dead loved one? So you can obviously now set up with all sorts of records that you have written and audio and whatever, a kind of AI bot of someone you have loved who has died. Is this, I guess the question is saying, what do they get out of that? Is that a good thing or potentially a bad thing?
I'm incapable of imagining that situation and indeed of answering the question.
I mean, I want to think about this. I talk to my dead father and dead mother all the time in some way or other. That is to say, they are in my head, and I have conversations with them. I mean, not out loud on the street, but I mean, I hear their voices in my head. So in that sense, it doesn't sound so bizarre to me. But what's peculiar about and I haven't tried what the question proposes, but what's peculiar about the experience as it's described is that the avatar presumably links together sentences, phrases that it's absorbed, that you've given it for your deceased loved one, and it puts them together. But what's interesting to me about my conversations, as I put it, with my deceased parents, is that I know that I'm putting the sentences together, that I'm actually in that sense in the internal conversation. I don't know what it would mean to have the conversation with a machine. I don't know how the artificial intelligence would to what it means to let that make the decisions as to how to put the pieces together.
One thing I think that it will lead to is people will give training data to the AI that excludes the things about let's say you had a parent who was oftentimes like not a good parent to you. You could feasibly train an AI on the good parts of that person's personality and leave out the things that were, upsetting, traumatic, like whatever, and sort of provide yourself with, the parent that you wish you'd had or should have had or whatever.
Seems like I mean,
well, the question might be, what are you wanting from AI that you can't get from a person?
Yeah, exactly. That's why I think it's an interesting question, because I think people will be doing all sorts of finding all sorts of ways to make their own ghosts, if you like.
I mean,
imagine if Hamlet could have said, "No, I don't like the way this ghost is talking. Well, I'm going to adjust his training data and get an answer that I prefer."
I find this. I mean, I'm fascinated by the question, but I find it rather unnerving. I mean, we'll see. I've done some experiments with the large language models now, and thus far, I mean, I think we're probably on the brink of something much more compelling and interesting. But thus far, I find the way the algorithm works is to give you the most predictable response, the most familiar and in that sense the least interesting response, with very little originality.
Do you think they're good at discussing Shakespeare? If you ask them, do they give good answers?
Not terribly, no. I mean, they're not terrible. They're sort of B minus answers, as it were. I mean, that they're perfectly, they're not terrible at all. It's just nothing interesting so far. But we may be on the brink of something more remarkable.
So here's a question from Adam. Second chances are associated with a range of concepts like self-knowledge, punishment, and renewal. Shakespeare is clearly obsessed with these. But how prevalent are second chances in the plays? So he sees them in Leontes and Prospero. Obviously, the tragic characters, he says, do they have the opportunities for second chances? Does Othello have a second chance with Desdemona when he realizes he's being manipulated? Does King Lear have a second chance with Cordelia at the end of the play?
No, I think actually, to take the latter two plays, both of them, and it's a sign of how absolutely conscious Shakespeare was of the idea of the second chance and of what he's playing with. I mean, this is not my discovery or Adam's discovery. This is something very much in Shakespeare's practice. You can notice the way in which it's actually very awkward for actors. You may remember that Desdemona revives bizarrely at the end, just in time to say, it was me, I didn't do it. I mean, it's not Othello, I did it to myself. I mean, and die again, as if to give him the tantalizing possibility of that second chance that he won't have. And likewise in King Lear, though actually the King Lear story, as Shakespeare used it, always had Cordelia surviving, so that the audience would have expected Cordelia to open her eyes and cough a little bit and get up again. Lear holds the mirror up to Cordelia's lips and or the feather, and says, "This feather stirs, she lives," or the mirror might be stained with her breath, and then she's dead. He doesn't have that experience. He only dreams, holds on to the idea that he have experience, but he doesn't have it.
I think those are all the. Oh, Jennifer, yes, please.
Wait, you're muted, Jennifer.
Yes, sorry for not taping out my question. It's perhaps not developed quite enough, so bear with me. This was great. It was good to really wonderful to hear the conversation. Just to return to where we started with this, part of the reason these plays have resonated for centuries is they speak to something that's perennial in the human experience. And I think in the book, I believe you suggest that this is, something that is part of our experiences, that things regenerate and we have these experiences of renewal. I think the really beautiful ending of Stephen's section speaks about this, and Adam certainly goes into it too, of it just being probably part of ways we understand the natural cycle and our observation of the natural world of the world's, things dying and passing away and regenerating. I'm struck, I've always been struck with, why the second chance, why is it not like a perpetual? Why isn't this a book about our capacity to regenerate our lives? Or it's specifically focused on the second chance. And I was really struck by what you said about the, Shakespeare as a post-Christian thinker. And I wondered if there was some sort of answer in that, in the sense that, you know, he was coming out of a world culture that you kind of had your life and then you die. You only die once, and you kind of have one chance. You're going to get into heaven, or you're going to be in purgatory, or you're going to go to hell, whatever it is. But it isn't actually a story of getting of, let's say, reincarnation, where you keep being offered opportunities to try again. So I wonder if you can answer that. Just you know, why only one second chance? I think in the book you don't completely limit the stories to that, but it is a distinct focus in the book. I'd love to just hear a little bit more about your thoughts about that.
Just briefly, one of the things we say in the book is that it's quite interesting that there are second chances, but not fourth chances or sixth chances. And I think the idea of the second chance is figurative or emblematic of the idea of renewal. So that, of course, in a way, there are renewals and revisions throughout life. Each one might feel like a second chance. And I think what the second chance idea does is it makes coherent a simple narrative, which is something happens that doesn't work out. Then you get a second chance, and it may or may not work out, but it could do. There's renewal and revision. That's the basic structure. Now that goes on happening. There are fourth chances and 12th chances, but the second chance is the way we formulate it, I think. So I think it's representative, but not conclusive.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I guess for me as well, there's the peculiar status of what you implicitly we're imagining as the first chance. And it's as if, let's say, the first chance, your birth family, it's as if after that first chance, there's only, no matter how many more there are, they're all second chances, as it were. That is to say, they're set against this first thing, which is nothing you choose. The point about where we began an hour ago talking about agency, there's no agency when you're born. There's that's what you're born into, and that extends to all of the circumstances that you're born into, which constitute, in some sense, your first chance. And then after that, yes, there can be many revisions, renewals, but in relation to the first chance, it's as if they're always the second chance after the first one, if you see what I'm saying.
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
Okay, David has now said, how important for the second chance is the abandonment of the first chance? I mean, I guess one answer is obviously super important, because otherwise you stay stuck. But I guess the word abandon is the significant thing.
In some ways, I mean, it's a very Emersonian word that Emerson says at one point, we live by abandonment. So I think that by definition, it's not that the first chance is abandoned, but it's revised, it's renewed, it's re-looked at, so that the hope or the wish is the second chance will make something come good that did not the first time round. And in that sense, you need the first chance to make the second chance viable. You need to have some idea as to what the first chance was, what didn't work about it, and what is to be done. That's what makes it a second chance.
And I guess to pick up what Adam just said in relation to David's interesting question, to confess that I felt a little bit in my own section of the book that I was slightly potentially cheating when I talked about the late play, Shakespeare's late plays as involving a second chance, because after all, Leontes gets Hermione back, his first wife. Prospero gets the dukedom of Milan, which was his original position. So in that sense, why isn't that just identical to the comedies, where you actually get you apparently get the first thing back? And the justification that I have is that in those late plays, the second time round is really a profound revision. first. You remember that moment in which Leontes says, looking at his wife whom he hasn't seen in 16 years, Hermione was not so much wrinkled as this is, he says. It's just an incredible thing to say. And he, of course, is wrinkled as well now. And those wrinkles mark the fact that this is not the first thing. This is a revision, as Adam puts it.
Yes, the word abandon is a good one. The character, I think, who lives most in the state of abandon is Falstaff. He's constantly ready to drop whatever is happening and take another second chance, which may actually not be a good thing. Too many second chances for him.
And of course, Falstaff is the spectacularly abandoned at the end of Henry IV.
Too much emphasis on the second chance for Falstaff. Okay, we don't have any other questions lined up. So unless one of you has something you'd like to ask, which you should, because you have two very, very wonderful people that you can ask about Shakespeare and Freud. So make yourselves known now before we end the call, because I've peppered them with enough of my questions. Julia, you look like you want to speak. Are you stuck on mute?
Yeah, I was stuck on mute.
Oh, there we go.
Goodness, I had so many questions at the beginning. I think that we've gone through a lot of them. I guess one would be, hold on, let me see. I had something written out prior. Let's see here. I had written, and this was following one of the Interlet courses, so it was on the topic of love, and we were speaking about the totalizing state of love in symposium. And what my question would be about is, in regards to Shakespearean romance, of lovers meeting, a lot of it involves them being separated and then coming back together. And I guess like a question that I had, and also in terms of second chances, is to do we crave like to overcome something, because do we crave obstacles in our lives to feel like we've overcome something, because to overcome something in order to get what we want, it makes it all the more precious and exciting and valuable. And I guess my question, second chances would be, and I know we spoke about suffering, is if, I guess the question kind of, or the thought would be, to not have things so smooth, and that to have these second chances and to create the suffering, and to if that's something that makes the end, or that makes the renewal all the more valuable to us, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think one of the things that happens in a second chance is the obstacle becomes the instrument. So that you're right, that obstacles stimulate desire. So on the one hand, you could think there is the need to find and make obstacles in order to see, it's like a love test. Am I able to get over this resistance? What am I willing to do for this person, or to have a relationship with this person? And similarly, I think the obstacle functions here as the clue to desire, because if you experience it as an obstacle, it's an obstacle to something you want.
Right.
Understand the obstacle before you can understand the object of desire, because it's the clue. If you feel somehow thwarted or limited or impeded or held up, it's you know you want something. There's something here.
That makes good sense.
One of the happiest couples, one of the few couples in Shakespeare's comedies that actually, to me, seem like that might work, is Beatrice and Benedict in Much Ado About Nothing. And the play suggests that they had had a relationship before the play begins, but there's no development of it. And then they fight through the entire play. And the pleasure of the play for an audience depends upon your feeling that the fighting is somehow itself, exactly as you put it, a kind of obstacle that they're enjoying producing, till they'll be able to fully renew their love for each other. It's a little bit there's a moment at the end of Shakespeare's career or near the end of The Tempest in which Prospero says he must says about his daughter and prospective son-in-law, I must make them uneasy, he says, lest too light winning make the prize too light. If they get it immediately, they're not going to value what they have. So it's exactly putting your principle in practice.
Thank you.
Okay, very good. Unless anyone has any more questions, we will draw things to a close. Thank you so much to Stephen and Adam. This was very interesting, and we appreciate it. And all of you can get this book if you don't already have it. It's very good. Many ideas that we've discussed tonight are in here and more. So rush out now. But otherwise, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.